The X-Men, Fox's cinematic universe, releasing a total of 14 movies and officially coming to an end in 2024 with the release of Deadpool and Wolverine. We all remember the homage to the X-Men franchise during the end credits of Deadpool and Wolverine. It was sad, it was bittersweet, but it also reignited a spark for interest in the X-Men. Many Marvel fans like me went to watch the movie because it takes place in the MCU. This caused so many Marvel fans that had previously only been interested in the MCU to go back and watch all the X-Men movies for the first time. Going into Deadpool and Wolverine, I had seen a few X-Men movies here and there, but had never fully committed to watching the whole thing, or even trying to comprehend the timeline. And that's what this video is about. After Deadpool and Wolverine, me and my friends got together to watch every single X-Men movie in release order, and wow is it confusing. The Fox timeline is all over the place. And genuinely, after watching every movie, I understand why Fox sold the IP to Disney. But of course, a bunch of those characters from the X-Men are returning in Avengers Doomsday, which is super exciting news. And so I want to try our best to put every single movie on a timeline and figure out which versions of the X-Men we're gonna see in Avengers Doomsday. The X-Men franchise started off relatively straightforward. The first X-Men movie was released in the year 2000. The movie explains how Wolverine gets introduced to Charles Xavier and the X-Men. It's a pretty straightforward plot, and it's definitely one of the best entries in the entire franchise. And the assumption is that the movie takes place in its release year. I've seen some breakdowns having it take place as late as 2004, but there's not a ton of evidence to back that up. For the simplicity of this timeline, we're gonna have it take place in the year 2000. Next up is X2. It is of course the second installment in the franchise. It's a bigger movie with bigger stakes, and it was a very successful movie sequel. A lot of movies try and have sequels, but the second movie just isn't as good as the first, and that is not the case for this movie. It follows the X-Men trying to stop the spread of anti-mutant measures taken by the government, as well as Wolverine trying to find out more about his past and how he got his adamantium skeleton. The first movie feels like a general X-Men introduction movie for a general movie-going audience, but the second movie feels a lot more like something straight out of the comics, and I love it. This movie is a little harder to place on the timeline because this movie seems to have taken place only a few months later, maybe 6 max, after the first movie. More than likely in the same year, which of course is the year 2000. But logistically, it would also make sense for this movie to be released in the same year as the movie was released, which was 2003. And honestly, there's not a ton of evidence to really point one way or the other, so I'm gonna leave it pretty generic and say it's somewhere between the year 2000 and 2003. But I tend to lean towards that 2003 date because of course the third movie takes place in 2006, and so to say that there's gonna be 6 years in between X2 and X3 just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And of course we mentioned X3, so next up is X-Men The Last Stand. The third installment in the franchise, and it's very controversial among fans. But personally, I love it. The movie kills off Cyclops, it kills off Charles Xavier, Mystique's mutant gene is cured, and of course Jean Grey becomes the Dark Phoenix. Obviously, it took a lot of controversial choices, but it was supposed to be the last movie in the main X-Men storyline, so they made some very dramatic choices with the script. The entire final act, where Magneto picks up and moves the Golden Gate Bridge to Alcatraz, is pure cinema. I know the choices it made were controversial, you don't have to like it, I'm just saying that I do. This movie does take place in the year 2006, which is the same year as it was released, so it is pretty easy to place on the timeline. But just wait though, because it starts to get really weird. And that's because the next movie Fox decided to go with was a prequel movie, X-Men Origins Wolverine. This one is also really controversial. It obviously follows the origins of Wolverine growing up with his brother Sabretooth, fighting in the Civil War, World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War, eventually joining Stryker's squad of commandos a few years later. The movie shows how Stryker implants the adamantium onto Wolverine's skeleton, and how he loses his memory before the events of the first X-Men. The movie also shows Gambit, Scott Summers, Emma Frost, and most famously, this atrocious version of Deadpool. This movie takes place a few years after the Vietnam War in 1979, and this is where the confusion starts. For starters, Scott Summers is a high school student in this movie, getting hunted down by Sabretooth and Stryker for his Weapon X program. It's pretty widely accepted that Scott is around 16 during this movie, putting his birthday in 1963. That means Scott is 37 during the events of the first 2 X-Men movies, and 43 when he dies in X-Men Last Stand. Which, I mean, I guess is possible, but it doesn't make a ton of sense. The actor playing Cyclops, James Marsden, was born in 1973, 10 years later than the 1963 birthday we just established. Realistically, Scott should be in his late 20s, early 30s during the first 3 X-Men movies, not his late 30s, early 40s. And Emma Frost being in this movie is a whole nother can of worms. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but like I mentioned, this movie takes place in 1979, so that is where we'll place it on the timeline. And really quick before we move to the next movie, remember this scene where Deadpool and Wolverine fight because it will be much more important later in this video. Next up is one of the best regarded movies in the entire franchise, X-Men First Class. It follows the origins of Charles Xavier and Magneto, and the backstory of how they became the good friends we always heard about in the first trilogy. The movie takes place in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it has some of the best scenes in any X-Men movie. The scene on the beach where Magneto stops all the missiles and sends them back towards the battleships is pure cinema, and I can never get enough of it. The movie sets up the creation of the X-Men and Charles' School for Gifted Kids. The biggest problem with this movie is the fact that Emma Frost is in it, and she's also like a grown adult. If you remember, she was a teenager in the last movie, which takes place 17 years later. And so how can she be a grown adult 17 years earlier? This was never explained and is just a glaring continuity error. And of course, it's just one of the many reasons this franchise is confusing. Regardless, the movie is easy to put on the timeline as the events follow real-world events. This movie lands as the earliest movie in the franchise in 1962. Up after that, we step away from the prequels and jump back to the present day. And that's because the next movie is The Wolverine. This is another one of the X-Men installments that has a ton of controversy, but personally, it's one of my favorite movies in the franchise. It follows Wolverine after the events of X-Men Last Stand. It deals heavily with the burden that Logan now carries after having to kill Jean Grey. It also has a flashback to the bombing of Nagasaki where Logan manages to save a Japanese soldier. And this is such a cool scene. We literally watch Wolverine take the full impact of an atomic bomb and survive. It's absolutely insane. I'm not going to dive super deep into the plot of this movie, but it takes place in modern day Japan and has Wolverine fighting ninjas. Like, come on, the dude with claws is fighting ninjas. Now, how cool is that? The plot also deals with Wolverine losing his healing factor, which adds much bigger stakes to the movie. One big part of the ending has Wolverine losing his claws to the Silver Samurai. Of course, the bone claws grow back because of his healing factor, but the adamantium coating is now gone. And this is the start to another plot hole, which we'll talk about here in a second. The post-credit scene has both Charles Xavier and Magneto meeting Wolverine and asking for his help. But of course, remember, Charles died. How is he back? Did he really die? Well, this is the only explanation we get.
You're not the only one with gifts.
So I guess it's not really a plot hole because he has gifts, but there is a plot hole here, and that's the fact that Magneto has his powers. If you remember back to X-Men The Last Stand, Magneto was hit with the mutant cure that he was trying to destroy, leaving him as a normal human. But mysteriously, he has his powers again, which I'm fine with. Magneto is my favorite character out of all the X-Men, but regardless, it's still a plot hole. The main events of this movie take place in 2013, and the post-credit scene takes place 2 years later in 2015. Next up, we have Days of Future Past, and this is really where it starts to get complicated. The movie starts in the year 2023 during the events of the Mutant War, where Trask and his Sentinels have wiped out nearly all of mutants. Wolverine is sent back in time to the year 1973, where he's supposed to change history and prevent the Mutant War from beginning. The movie includes both casts from the original X-Men trilogy to play the future versions of the X-Men, as well as all the actors to play the younger, past versions of these characters from X-Men First Class. This is definitely one of the best X-Men movies with some of the best scenes. We have Quicksilver breaking into the Pentagon to break Magneto out of his secret underground prison, but the addition of this movie does not make the timeline any less confusing. For starters, time travel works differently in this movie than we've seen it in the MCU with Endgame and the TVA, and that's also an entire video for a different time. But for the simplicity of this timeline, we're going to be going with the branch universe version of the time travel that we see in Endgame. That's because when he goes back in time and fixes the past, he actually creates a new timeline separate from the timeline we've been on this entire time. The new 2023 actually shows us the return of both Jean Grey and Scott Summers, both characters that died in X-Men Last Stand. And so we can place the split in the timeline just after First Class, meaning that First Class is still the origin story for both timelines. The past scenes in this movie takes place in the year 1973, so that will be the first addition to the new timeline. we can place the old 2023 scene at the end of the original timeline, and then we can place the new 2023 scene at the end of the newest timeline. Now, I don't want to get too sidetracked, but there is so much missed potential introduced in this movie. Charles and Magneto confront Wolverine in the year 2015, and the beginning of this movie doesn't take place until 2023, meaning we are missing out on 8 years of the original X-Men working with Magneto leading up to the Mutant Wars. This sounds like such great story potential. I always love when Magneto works with the X-Men, and it would have been great to see for the 8 years in the timeline that we're missing. Also, we of course are introduced to the new 2023 timeline that was introduced where all the original cast from the X-Men is alive and well, meaning on the new timeline they didn't die in X-Men Last Stand. That means there's a time period from 2006 to 2023 where the original X-Men cast are still together, and we will never get to see any of it other than a small cameo we see in a future movie. And that of course we'll talk about later. And I just think this is such a missed opportunity. X-Men found a way to do a hard reset on their universe and then proceeded to only make prequel movies that have nothing to do with their hard reset. Next up is everyone's favorite Deadpool. This is the first R-rated X-Men movie and is easily one of my favorite installments. This movie is actually pretty easy to place on the timeline, and that's because it's the first movie on the new X-Men timeline, and it takes place in the year it was released, which is 2016. And I'm not going to dive super deep into it, just because we've still got a lot of movies to go. After that is X-Men Apocalypse. This is another controversial installment, which I personally really like. It's nowhere near some of my favorites, but it has some great scenes. It also has the iconic Quicksilver scene. It introduces this timeline's version of Storm, Jean, and Cyclops. It also shows how Wolverine breaks out of Stryker's facility in one of the coolest scenes in the entire franchise. This movie takes place in 1983, meaning 10 years after Days of Future Past, and 20 years after First Class, and that's the biggest plot hole with this movie, is that characters like Magneto, Charles, Mystique, and Beast haven't aged at all in 20 years. And I mean, they are mutants, maybe they don't age the same as we do, but the real explanation is that trying to age these characters would have cost too much money and would have been much more trouble than it's worth. But I will say, I think it's genuinely the funniest thing they felt like they had to explain why Professor X is bald. Like, it wasn't as simple as, oh, I'm trying a new look. It had to come down to Charles getting it, like, permanently zapped off his head, and I think that's just the funniest thing. This movie takes place in 1983, and so that's where we'll place it on the new timeline. You can definitely see why these movies start to get confusing. Not because of the timeline splitting, but because of the time jumping in between movies. We start in the early 2000s, jump back to the 60s, forward to the present, then to the future in 2023, back to the 70s, then forward to the present, then back to the 80s, and then back forward into the distant future for the next installment, Logan. Logan is the second R-rated installment in the X-Men, and it's pretty widely considered one, if not the best X-Men movie. Wolverine's whole shtick is having claws, so an R-rated Wolverine movie is something we've needed for years. Limiting him to the constraints of PG-13 has definitely held Wolverine back from his true potential. Regardless of how much I like this movie, it really throws a wrench in the timeline. This movie's supposed to take place in the distant future of 2029, where Dr. Xander Rice has found a way to suppress the mutant gene, and no mutants have been born in 25 years, so around 2004 was the last day mutants were born. It's also shown that Professor X is dealing with dementia and has accidentally killed pretty much all the X-Men. Both Charles and Logan die at the end of the movie, and it essentially marks the end of mutant kind. And there's a lot to take in here. For starters, this movie only takes place 6 years after we see the X-Men at the end of Days of Future Past, meaning that in just 6 years, the happy ending we see here completely hits the fan and basically everyone dies. Which is just so sad to see. The mutants are all destroyed in 2023 during the old Days of Future Past timeline, and they end up going extinct anyway in the new timeline. And so what was the point of Days of Future Past if no matter what, mutants go extinct? I've seen a lot of people saying that Logan must take place in a different timeline, but there's no really straightforward answer, and as far as I can tell, this movie takes place in the same branch as Days of Future Past. There may be one workaround this, but I'll bring that up here in a second. This one takes place in, of course, 2029, so that's where we'll place it on the timeline. Next up is Deadpool 2, one of my favorite movies in the franchise, and it most certainly lives up to the expectations set by the first movie. And of course, this movie brings back time travel, which honestly makes for some of the funniest bits in the whole movie, but man does it make this timeline more complicated. If you haven't seen the movie or you need a refresher, during the credits of the movie, Deadpool gets a hold of Cable's time travel device and goes back in time to save his girlfriend from dying, who of course died at the beginning of the movie. This action on its own of course would create a branched timeline where she survives, but he also travels back in time to the events of X-Men Origins to kill that version of Deadpool, which definitely complicates things because that movie is on a completely different timeline. Theoretically, that would create an additional branch of the original timeline, but we don't see that version of Deadpool ever return, and ultimately, it amounts to nothing. So for simplicity, we are only going to create one branch timeline from Saving Vanessa, and we'll place Deadpool 2 on that branch as well. I do want to point out that we do see the X-Men in this movie, specifically Cyclops. It's a bit played off for jokes, but they are present, further showing that this timeline is the same as the fixed Days of Future Past timeline. Next up is probably one of the most hated X-Men movies of all time, and that is Dark Phoenix. I'm not going to dive super deep into the plot, but it's Fox's second attempt at the Dark Phoenix storyline, and it goes just as good as you would expect. The movie takes place in 1992, 9 years after the events of X-Men Apocalypse, where of course none of the characters have aged since 1963. But anyway, the movie eventually ends with Mystique dying and Jean Grey kind of dying and becoming one with the Phoenix, which opens yet another plot hole. That of course being that Dark Phoenix takes place in the Branch timeline. And of course, if you remember, Jean Grey is alive and well during the ending of Days of Future Past, which takes place in 2023. So how could she have died in 1992? I've seen some people argue that she doesn't die, she just becomes one with the Phoenix, as one of the last clips shown in the movie. I don't necessarily agree with this. She loses her physical form whenever she sacrifices herself for the team, but Jean did already find a way to return in X-Men Last Stand, even if it was the Phoenix and not actually Jean Grey. And so for timeline's sake, we're just gonna say that she found a way to return and is present during Days of Future Past. That being said, we can place this movie in 1992 on the Branch timeline. We're almost there, only 2 movies left. Next being New Mutants. This movie had lots of problems. It was supposed to release a few years earlier, being filmed in 2017, but Disney buying Fox caused this movie to initially be delayed, and then COVID in 2020 caused it to be delayed even further. This movie is honestly forgettable, and that makes sense because it doesn't have much to do with the overall plot, considering it's the last real movie in the X-Men universe. There was a scene in this movie taken straight out of Logan where young mutants are being experimented on. This has created some confusion regarding the timeline of this movie, but the inclusion of this scene has largely been written off as lazy reuse from the previous scene, and the movie is not believed to take place post-Logan in 2029. Even though this movie was released in 2020, I'm going to place it around 2018, as that is closer to the intended release date of the film. Now of course we have Deadpool and Wolverine, the first ever R-rated movie in the MCU, and a movie that bridged the Fox universe and the MCU. While I absolutely love this movie, it is so confusing regarding a timeline. This movie takes place in present day, a few years after Deadpool 2, in the alternate timeline where Deadpool saves Vanessa. His reality is falling apart after the death of its anchor being, of course being Logan. But that's the thing, this movie takes place in 2024, and Logan doesn't die until 2026. So how is the Fox timeline falling apart? Well, the TVA exists in a dimension outside of space and time. And so what I think they're trying to say is that an anchor being is the anchor of the universe. It holds it together, and so when that person dies, the whole universe falls apart. But like I said, the TVA exists outside of time. So if Wolverine is dead in 2029, then Wolverine has always been dead from the TVA's perspective. A good example of this comes from Loki Season 1. We see 2012 Loki watch his death in Avengers Infinity War in the TVA, even though 2012 Loki had never experienced it. So why is the X-Men universe all of a sudden falling apart? It makes no sense. Deadpool even goes to the place where Wolverine died because he believes that Logan wasn't actually dead because of his healing factor. But he does get there using the TVA device, and he is pretty clearly dead. That brings up another question. When is Deadpool visiting Wolverine's grave? Because if it's in present day, then of course that makes no sense, because why would Wolverine already be dead? But if it takes place after Wolverine's death, then why would he even be there to begin with? If Deadpool is trying to recruit Wolverine, why doesn't he just use the TVA device to go back in time before Logan died? Why jump from multiverse to multiverse looking for a Wolverine variant when Deadpool could have just grabbed a past Wolverine? I know it's explained that Anchor Being's existence can't be altered with, and that's why Deadpool can't just take a past Wolverine, but if the Anchor Being's whole point of existence is holding together their multiverse, then you think that Deadpool traveling back in time to recruit a younger Wolverine to keep this multiverse from collapsing would fall into that role. Heck, forget a past Wolverine, what about the present Wolverine? In 2024, Logan hasn't died yet. He actually just got back from the time travel experience that happened in Days of Future Past. So you would think that if his timeline was ending, present-day Wolverine would be able to help fix the problem, as the timeline would literally not exist without them. Also, the variant Wolverine we see in Deadpool and Wolverine stays in Deadpool's universe after the events of the movie, meaning there are currently 2 Wolverines in this timeline. the 2024 Logan that hasn't died yet, and the new variant. Wouldn't having 2 Wolverines in the same universe be enough for the TVA to prune the universe? Regardless of this very confusing plot points, the clear mention of Logan's death happening in this timeline requires this movie to take place on the same timeline as Deadpool 2 and Logan, meaning that we can place it on the Deadpool 2 branch timeline, and we can also move Logan to take place on this branch timeline. And this actually opens up a pretty exciting possibility. Since we have moved Logan, that now actually leaves the original branch of Days of Future Past timeline with an open ending. Logan is no longer forcing the mutants to go extinct in 2029 in this timeline. Now, you could argue that the events of Logan still take place in both timelines, but the Fox universe is over, and for the sake of a happy ending, I'm going to leave this timeline with an open ending. Now, of course, that begs the question, what version of the X-Men are going to show up in Doomsday? And from what timeline are they going to be from? Well, there is another movie we have to add somewhere to the timeline, and that's actually The Marvels. If you forgot or didn't see this movie, I don't blame you if you skipped this one. The post-credit scene reveals that Monica Rambeau got transported to a parallel universe where we see Beast. Monica Rambeau had been transported to the X-Men universe. And I think this post-credit scene will heavily play into how the X-Men will get transported into the MCU for Doomsday. I think the most obvious answer would be to say that the X-Men jumping to the MCU are the X-Men that we see in the ending of Days of Future Past. It has all the actors from the original trilogy, and they exist in 2023. This would align perfectly with the casting announcement for Doomsday. If you remember, Patrick Stewart, Ian McKellen, James Marsden, Rebecca Romijn, Alan Cumming, and Kelsey Grammer are the actors that are going to be playing these versions of the X-Men, not the younger counterparts that we see in the prequel movies. And this works perfectly for the ages of all the actors. Doomsday is expected to take place in present day around 2026-2027 when the movie releases, and so choosing the older actors provides evidence that would lead us to believe that these X-Men are the ones that we'll see in Doomsday. But of course, with the countless plot holes throughout this universe, we have a problem. The ending of Days of Future Past takes place on the first branch timeline, and if you remember, Mystique dies during the events of Dark Phoenix, taking place in 1992, and there is no evidence of her being alive in the 2023 Days of Future Past scene. And of course, Mystique is announced to be returning for Doomsday, and so realistically, the version of the X-Men we'll see in Doomsday can't come from this branch timeline. And this sucks. I really wanted to see this version of the X-Men again, as there is so much story that is left open. But what are the other options that exist? I think we want to stay away from X-Men First Class. Obviously, they cast the older actors because they wanted to show that these are present-day versions of the X-Men in 2026. If they were going to somehow incorporate past versions of them, they would have casted the younger actors. And so that leaves 2 possible options. The X-Men in the year 2023 from the beginning of Days of Future Past, but of course before Wolverine travels back in time. These X-Men would be the proper age and played by the proper actors. This would also work great too because Mystique is still alive. She did get shot with the mutant cure in X-Men Last Stand and loses her powers, but if you remember, so did Magneto. And Magneto has his powers back in the Wolverine post-credit scene that takes place 9 years later. So it definitely is a possibility that Mystique could have gotten her powers back too. The X-Men from Days of Future Past on the original timeline would be perfect candidates to show up in Doomsday if there wasn't another glaring plot hole. If you remember back to X-Men Last Stand, Cyclops is killed off by the Dark Phoenix. And so there is no way the X-Men could be a part of this timeline because Cyclops is dead and James Marsden is supposed to return to Cyclops. And so that only leaves one option. It's that somehow the X-Men from X1 or X2 got transported to the future and into the MCU to play the role in Doomsday. And that just leaves the big problem of the actors being way too old to play their 2003 selves, but at this point there really isn't any other options. As far as the Marvel's post-credit scene goes, Monica didn't get transported back in time, only moved to an alternate universe, and so Fox and their plot holes have left us with no choice. I'm gonna place the Marvel's post-credit scene on the branch timeline after Days of Future Past, because besides Mystique, this seems like the perfect candidate for the X-Men to come from. Realistically, I think Doomsday is gonna do one of 3 things. 1, they are gonna say the X-Men came from this timeline and completely ignore the fact that Mystique is dead. 2, they're gonna come from a random alternate timeline that we've never seen before. Or 3, the most likely, they're gonna leave this entire thing vague and not explain where they come from because they know the timeline is way too confusing to explain. And honestly, I hate all of these choices, but especially the second 2. We like the X-Men because we know what they've gone through. We've seen their stories and we empathize with them. But if we just get a random version of these characters from a random timeline, we completely lose the ability to empathize with them because we've never seen their stories. But there we go, we've officially placed every single X-Men movie on the timeline. And I would love to know what you guys have to think about it. It's messy and it obviously has plot holes, but I believe it is the best way to represent the Fox universe on a timeline. But let me know down in the comments below if there's anything you would change. Make sure to check out the other videos on my channel, hit the like button and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Thank you so much for watching.